The dust swirled in lazy circles around the makeshift auction platform as Judge Morrison's gavel struck the wooden block for the fourth time that morning. 3 Apache women had already been sold into servitude, their heads bowed as they were led away by their new masters. The crowd of ranchers and townspeople pressed closer, their voices a low rumble of excitement and greed. But it was the 4th woman who made Elijah Brooks tighten his grip on his reins. Tan stood with her chin raised, dark eyes fixed on the distant mountains where her people once roamed free. Even with her hands bound behind her back, even dressed in the rough cotton dress the authorities had forced her into, she carried herself like royalty. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty square of Prescott, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled overhead, its cry cutting through the humid Arizona air. Elijah had ridden into town for supplies, nothing more. At 48, he had seen enough of the world's cruelties during the war, and afterward, when fever took his wife Martha and their boy Samuel. He kept to himself now, working his small ranch in the shadow of the Bradshaw Mountains, speaking to no one unless necessary. But something about this scene made his stomach turn, made him remember why he had fought in the first place. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the crowd like a preacher at Sunday service. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have here Tan, Apache squaw, charged with cattle rustling and conspiracy against the territorial government. The evidence is clear as mountain water. She was found near stolen cattle, and her brother has already confessed to his crimes before fleeing to Mexico." The crowd murmured its approval, but Elijah noticed how Tan's jaw tightened at the mention of her brother. He had spent enough time around Apache traders to recognize the look of someone protecting family, not someone guilty of theft. The whole thing stank worse than a 3-day-old carcass. Morrison continued his performance, gesturing toward Tan like she was a prize bull. "The debt owed to the territory amounts to $200, plus court costs. She will serve a term of indentured servitude until this debt is paid in full. Bidding starts at $5 a month for her services." A heavy-set man in a black suit raised his hand immediately. The name was Henry Caldwell, and Elijah knew his reputation. Caldwell owned the largest ranch in the territory, and he worked his Mexican and Indian laborers harder than mules. $5, Caldwell called out, his voice thick with satisfaction. $8, shouted another voice from the crowd. Then 10. The bidding continued, and with each raise, Elijah felt something stirring in his chest that he had not felt since before the war. It was anger, pure and clean, the kind that had driven him to charge Confederate lines at Gettysburg. Tan never looked at the crowd, never acknowledged the men who bid on her like she was livestock. Instead, she kept her eyes on those distant mountains, and Elijah could almost hear what she was thinking. Her people called those peaks sacred, and now she might never see them again as a free woman. $15, Caldwell said, his voice confident. The other bidders had dropped out. Morrison raised his gavel, clearly eager to finish the morning's business. Going once for $15 a month to Henry Caldwell. That was when Elijah saw it. A single tear rolling down Tan's cheek, so quick that most of the crowd missed it. But he saw it, and in that moment, he saw Martha's face the day the fever took hold, saw his boy Samuel asking why the world could be so cruel to innocent people. "Going twice," Morrison called out. Elijah looked down at his horse, Thunder, a coal-black stallion he had raised from a colt. The animal was worth more than most men made in 2 years, worth more than his ranch, worth more than everything he owned combined. Thunder had been his companion through the loneliest nights, his transportation across the vast Arizona territory, his pride and joy. But looking at Tan, standing there with such dignity in the face of such humiliation, Elijah Brooks made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that somehow carried across the entire square. The crowd turned as he walked toward the platform, leading Thunder behind him. Judge Morrison paused, gavel still raised. The silence stretched like a taut rope, and somewhere in the distance, that hawk cried again, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Every eye in the square followed Elijah as he approached the platform, his weathered boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. Thunder's hooves echoed against the hard-packed earth, a rhythmic sound that seemed to match the beating of every heart in the crowd. Judge Morrison lowered his gavel slightly, confusion creasing his lined face as he watched this unexpected interruption unfold. "Your Honor," Elijah called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in battle. "I believe there has been a mistake in the bidding process." The crowd shifted restlessly, whispers rippling through the gathered ranchers and townspeople like wind through wheat. Henry Caldwell stepped forward, his face reddening beneath his black hat. "What kind of mistake, Brooks?" "The bidding is clear as day. $15 a month, and she is mine." Elijah stopped directly in front of the platform, close enough that he could see the surprise flickering in Tan's dark eyes. For the first time since the proceedings began, she looked directly at him, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. There was intelligence there, and pride, and something else that reminded him of the wild horses he sometimes saw running free across the desert. "The mistake, Your Honor, is in the assumption that money is the only currency of value in this territory." Elijah reached up and removed his hat, running his fingers through graying hair that had once been as black as Thunder's coat. "This here is Thunder, finest stallion in 3 counties. He has bloodlines that trace back to Spanish horses brought by conquistadors. He is worth more than $500 to any man who knows horseflesh." Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Are you suggesting some kind of trade, Brooks? This is a legal proceeding, not a horse market." "I am suggesting," Elijah said quietly, "that this horse has more soul than most of the men in this square. And if you are selling souls today, then you should accept the finest soul being offered." The silence that followed was so complete that Elijah could hear the leather creaking as men shifted in their saddles, could hear the distant sound of children playing somewhere in town, could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Henry Caldwell sputtered, his face now the color of fresh blood. "This is ridiculous, Morrison. You cannot seriously consider accepting a horse in payment for legal debts. There are proper procedures, proper forms of currency." But Judge Morrison was studying Thunder with the eye of a man who had spent his youth around horses before the law called to him. The stallion stood perfectly still, his black coat gleaming in the Arizona sun, his neck arched with natural nobility. Everyone in the territory knew Thunder by reputation, had heard stories of the horse that could outrun Apache ponies and carry a rider for days without tiring. Tan watched this exchange with growing understanding. She did not speak much English, but she understood the language of sacrifice when she saw it. This white man, this stranger, was offering something precious for her freedom. She had seen enough of white men to know that most valued their horses above almost anything else, sometimes above their own families. "The appraised value of the debt is $200, Morrison said slowly, as if thinking aloud. "The horse is clearly worth more than that amount." He looked up at Elijah with something that might have been respect. "Are you certain about this trade, Brooks? Thunder is known throughout the territory." Elijah handed the reins to the judge's clerk, his movements steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Your Honor. Some debts can only be paid with honor, and some chains can only be broken by sacrifice." Morrison nodded slowly, then turned to Tan. "By the power vested in me by the territorial government of Arizona, your debt is hereby considered paid in full. You are free to go." The rope binding Tan's hands was cut by the clerk, and she rubbed her wrists where the rough hemp had left marks. She stepped down from the platform with the same dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal, but when she reached Elijah, she stopped and spoke a single word in Apache before switching to careful English. "Why?" Her voice was soft but clear, carrying a musical quality that reminded Elijah of water flowing over stones. "Because everyone deserves to see those mountains as a free person," he replied, nodding toward the distant peaks that had held her gaze throughout the auction. The crowd was beginning to disperse, some grumbling about the irregularity of the proceedings, others simply eager to get back to their own business. Henry Caldwell stalked away without another word, but Elijah could feel the man's anger like heat from a forge. This would not be the end of Caldwell's interest in Tan, and Elijah knew he had just made a powerful enemy. As they walked away from the square together, Tan fell into step beside him, her moccasined feet making no sound on the dusty ground. Behind them, Thunder was being led away by the clerk, and Elijah felt each step like a physical pain. But when he glanced at the woman walking beside him, saw the way she held her head high and watched the world with alert, intelligent eyes, he knew he had made the right choice. The question now was what happened next, and whether they could both survive the consequences of his decision. The journey to Elijah's ranch should have taken 4 hours on horseback, but walking in the blazing Arizona heat stretched it into an all-day ordeal. They had been traveling for 3 hours when Tan suddenly stopped, her hand raised in warning. Elijah halted immediately, years of war having taught him to trust such instincts, even from someone he barely knew. "Riders," she whispered, pointing toward a distant dust cloud moving fast across the desert floor. 3, maybe 4. Coming from town. Elijah squinted against the sun's glare and cursed under his breath. He recognized the riding style before he could make out the faces. Henry Caldwell and his men, no doubt coming to settle what they saw as an unfinished business. Without Thunder, Elijah felt vulnerable in a way he had not experienced since his war days, when Confederate cavalry could appear over any hill. "We need cover," he said, scanning the sparse landscape around them. The nearest rocks were a quarter-mile away, too far to reach before the riders caught up. But Tan was already moving, not toward the rocks but toward a shallow wash that cut across the desert like a scar. "Here," she said, dropping into the depression and motioning for him to follow. The sides were barely 3 feet deep, but she began scooping out sand and stones with her hands, creating a shallow dugout. "Water made this," she explained as she worked. "We'll make it again when rains come. Earth remembers." Elijah joined her in digging, impressed by her quick thinking and knowledge of the land. Within minutes, they had carved out a space deep enough to hide them if they lay flat. They pressed themselves against the cool earth just as the sound of galloping hooves grew loud enough to distinguish individual horses. Caldwell's voice carried across the desert air, rough with anger and exertion. "Tracks end here somewhere, but I do not see how they just vanished. That Apache witch probably used some kind of devil magic." "Search the rocks over there," another voice called out. "And check that wash. They could be hiding like snakes in a hole." Elijah felt Tan tense beside him as the hoofbeats came closer. Her breathing was so controlled it was almost inaudible, and he realized she had probably hidden from white men before, probably many times. The thought filled him with an anger that surprised him with its intensity. The horses stopped directly above them, and Elijah could smell dust and sweat filtering down into their hiding place. A shadow passed over the wash as one of the riders dismounted and walked to the edge. Elijah held his breath, acutely aware of Tan's warmth beside him, of how her presence had somehow become important to him in just a few hours. "Nothing here but old coyote tracks," the man called out. "They must have doubled back toward the mountains." Caldwell's frustrated curse echoed off the rocks before the hoofbeats began to fade in the direction of the distant peaks. They waited until the sound disappeared completely before climbing out of their hiding place, both of them covered in red dust and breathing hard from the tension. "You knew they would come," Tan said as they brushed themselves off. "It was not a question." "Caldwell is not a man who accepts defeat easily," Elijah replied. "And he considers you his property, regardless of what the judge decided. We will need to be careful." As they resumed walking, Tan began to speak, her voice thoughtful and measured. "My brother Nailnish did not steal cattle. He tried to save children from mission school, children taken from families. White men said he stole horses to help children escape, so he had to run to Mexico mountains where grandmother's people live. I stayed to lead them away from his trail, let myself be caught." The simple honesty of her confession hit Elijah like a physical blow. She had sacrificed her freedom to protect her brother and a group of children, had allowed herself to be captured and sold rather than reveal where they had gone. It was the kind of courage he had seen in the best soldiers during the war, the willingness to face certain suffering for others. "Your brother is lucky to have such a sister," he said quietly. "Family is everything," she replied. "Without family, without tribe, person is just wind in empty canyon." She looked at him with curious eyes. "You have family, Elijah Brooks?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he was back in that little cabin, watching Fever take his wife and son while he stood helpless. "I had a family once. Wife named Martha, boy named Samuel. Fever took them both 5 winters ago." Tan nodded with understanding that needed no words. Grief was a language that crossed all boundaries of culture and race, and she had clearly spoken it herself. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon heat beginning to ease as shadows grew longer. When they finally topped the rise that looked down on Elijah's ranch, the sight that greeted them made both of them stop dead in their tracks. Smoke was rising from the direction of his house, and even from a distance, they could see horses in his corral that did not belong there. Caldwell had not been searching the desert randomly. He had been driving them away from the ranch while his other men made themselves at home. "Looks like they found a different way to settle accounts," Elijah said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. Tan studied the scene below with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read danger from a young age. "4 men, maybe 5. They think you will come back alone, think you will be easy to take." Elijah looked at her, this woman who had already shown more courage and intelligence in one day than most people displayed in a lifetime. "Maybe I will not be coming back alone," he said. For the first time since he had seen her on that auction platform, Tan smiled, and it transformed her entire face. The expression was fierce and beautiful and completely unafraid. "We will see how brave they are when Apache wind blows through their plans," she said. The plan came together as naturally as if they had been working as partners for years rather than hours. Tan's knowledge of moving unseen across the landscape combined with Elijah's understanding of his own property created a strategy that neither could have managed alone. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they circled wide around the ranch, approaching from the blind side where the barn would shield their movements. Caldwell had made himself comfortable on Elijah's front porch, his boots propped up on the railing while 2 of his men lounged in chairs stolen from inside the house. A third man was examining Thunder, who had been tied to the corral fence, while a 4th rifled through Elijah's belongings with casual disregard. The sight of strangers pawing through Martha and Samuel's things filled Elijah with a cold rage that was somehow more dangerous than the hot anger he had felt in town. "They expect you to come riding up the main trail like an honest man," Tan whispered as they crouched behind the water trough. "They think all white men fight the same way, straight ahead like charging buffalo." From their hiding spot, Elijah could see that his rifle was still in its place above the mantel, visible through the open door. If he could create enough of a distraction to reach it, the odds would shift dramatically in their favor. But first, they needed to separate the men, make them vulnerable. "Can you get to the corral without them seeing you?" he asked. Tan's smile was answer enough. "Apache children learn to move like shadows before they learn to walk," she said, already beginning to fade back into the landscape in a way that seemed almost supernatural to Elijah's eyes. While she disappeared toward the corral, Elijah began working his way around to the side of the house where a window would give him access to his rifle. The minutes stretched like hours as he waited for Tan's signal, every nerve in his body alert to the slightest sound or movement from Caldwell's men. The signal, when it came, was not what he expected. Instead of some subtle Apache trick, it was the sound of Thunder's hooves suddenly pounding across the hard-packed earth of the corral. Somehow, Tan had not only reached the stallion unseen but had also freed him and now rode bareback with the skill of someone born to it. The horse responded to her touch as if they had known each other for years, wheeling and dancing with fluid grace that took everyone by surprise. "What in the hell?" Caldwell shouted, leaping to his feet as Thunder burst from the corral with Tan clinging to his back like a part of the horse itself. She let out a war cry that echoed off the mountains, a sound that spoke of generations of warriors and free spirits that no amount of civilization could ever fully tame. 2 of Caldwell's men immediately ran toward the corral, shouting and trying to cut off her escape route, while the 3rd fumbled for his rifle. In the confusion, Elijah slipped through the side window and had his hands on his own weapon before anyone noticed his presence. "Caldwell," he called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. The big man spun around, his hand moving toward his gun, but stopped when he saw the rifle trained on his chest. "You are trespassing on my land, Caldwell." and theft is still a crime in this territory, last I checked. For a moment, the standoff held, with Tan still circling on Thunder just outside rifle range while the other men tried to decide whether to draw their weapons or surrender. Then Caldwell's face twisted into an ugly sneer that revealed his true nature. "You think you won something today, Brooks? You think trading your horse for that Apache squaw makes you some kind of hero? She will be back in chains before the month is out, and you will be dead in a ditch." "Maybe," Elijah replied calmly. "But today is not that day." What happened next surprised everyone, including Elijah. Tan guided Thunder straight toward the group of men, but instead of trying to escape, she rode directly to where Caldwell stood. In one fluid motion, she dropped from the horse's back and landed beside the man who had tried to buy her freedom just hours earlier. "Henry Caldwell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone speaking an absolute truth. "You steal land from my people, steal children from families, steal dignity from everyone you touch. But you cannot steal what matters most." She placed her hand on Thunder's neck, and the stallion immediately calmed, as if her touch carried some kind of peace that even the chaos around them could not disturb. This horse chose freedom over comfort, chose honor over safety. That is why he is worth more than all your money, more than all your power. Caldwell stared at her with a mixture of hatred and confusion, clearly not understanding how a woman he had considered property could speak with such confidence and wisdom. His men looked equally uncertain, their loyalty wavering in the face of something they could not quite comprehend. "Take your men and leave my land," Elijah said, his rifle still trained on Caldwell's chest. "If I see any of you here again, I will consider it an act of war." The threat carried weight because everyone in the territory knew Elijah's reputation as a soldier and a marksman. Caldwell's men began backing toward their horses, eager to escape a situation that had spiraled far beyond their understanding. But Caldwell himself lingered, his pride warring with his self-preservation. "This is not over, Brooks. The territorial government will not stand for this kind of lawlessness." "Then I guess the territorial government will have to explain why they were selling innocent people like livestock," Elijah replied. "I am sure the newspapers in Phoenix would find that story interesting." As Caldwell and his men finally rode away, Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not even realized he was carrying. Tan stood beside Thunder, her hand still resting on the stallion's neck, and both horse and woman seemed to glow in the golden light of the setting sun. "Why did you come back?" Elijah asked. "You could have kept riding, could have been free." Tan looked at him with those dark eyes that held so much wisdom and strength. "Freedom is not about running away," she said. "Freedom is about choosing where you belong." She gestured toward the mountains, then toward the house, then toward him. "My brother is safe in Mexico, children are safe with grandmother's people. But this place, this moment, this choice to stand with someone who understands honor, this is also where I belong." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elijah Brooks realized that sometimes the most important journeys are not about the distance traveled, but about the courage to stand still and fight for what matters. And sometimes, the greatest freedom comes not from being alone, but from choosing to build something meaningful with someone who shares your values. Thunder nickered softly, as if agreeing with the sentiment, and Tan laughed, a sound like water over stones that seemed to heal something in Elijah's wounded heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, they had won something precious, the knowledge that honor still existed in a world that often seemed to have forgotten its meaning.